So it is my privilege to welcome my dear brother in Christ, Canon Mark. So I will turn it over to you now, Canon. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Bishop Sutton. It's really an honor to be here with you. Thank you for that introduction. Apparently I need to update that bio because my kids are now 28, 23, and 18. Since I typed that, the 18-year-old just graduated high school, and I just had a second grandchild about 2 months ago. So 28-year-old had. So I need to update that, but I'm glad to share that with you. It's much good. But again, really honored and thankful, Bishop Sutton, that you would have me and consider your partnership with the AAC and the work we're doing worth sharing with this group here and with this general council. So just thankful to be here. So just a little more background, because I'm aware as a speaker, I've met some of you, but many of you I've not met, and obviously there's a certain amount of why should we listen to this guy? Well, Bishop Sutton recommended it and invited me. That's certainly true, and I do this revitalization work across the province. But just to give a little more background and why revitalization and why that's my passion and why and what I'm going to share with you, I think will be helpful for your local congregations revitalizing where needed. So as Bishop Sutton said, I was raised in Western New York, south of Buffalo, but I was I've been Anglican my whole life is the point there. I was in an Anglican or Episcopal church in Ellicottville, New York, that had 16 people in it. 6 of them were my immediate family. And so it's a small little church, and I was the altar boy, and I did everything. I had to play the shepherd and the sheep. I did everything that you do in a church. I just grew up in Anglican church, and then when we moved to Florida, I was as active as you could be in Episcopal church there, and just youth group, and I worked happening youth retreats, and I was a camp counselor while I was in college, and I led youth ministry through college. And I just in the Episcopal church back in the day, they had EYC, Episcopal Young Church People, or something like that. I was like poster boy youth, right? So I did everything you're supposed to do. Well, in the midst of all of that, I had no clue who Jesus was. I had no idea what a relationship with God was, that I was a sinner, that Jesus died on the cross. None of that meant anything, but I could recite the liturgy. I knew all the colors of the season. I knew what all the seasons, all the stuff. So I just know it all, but I didn't have that relationship with Jesus. And so after I graduated college, I decided to be done with church altogether. I was just over it. I was sick of trying to be this good Christian and failing at it miserably so consistently. So I said, I'm just going to go to Colorado, snow ski, and smoke pot, and do all the bad stuff that I was doing anyway, and stop feeling guilty about it on church on Sunday. At any rate, long story short, I 2 months after that decision, and I walked away from the church, I accepted Jesus as my Savior. And I won't tell you that long story, but the Lord just revealed himself to me, and through some people, and immediately I was just on fire for the Lord, and have been so since 1994. But part of that sense that when I became a Christian, I had a sense of call pretty quickly to the priesthood, and part of that sense of call from early on was this call to mission. And I was like, people need to know about Jesus. People, you can be church and you can be in all these things, but you got to have the relationship. So I just been passionate about mission and evangelism since the get-go, because just people need to hear it. And then I went to seminary, and I was in my late 20s, and everyone was talking about church planting. And so I was like, hey, church planting. And I'm sure as you've talked about church planting with the REC 100, you've talked about the statistics where, the numbers of conversions that happen with church plants tends to be higher than in existing congregations. So I heard that in the late 90s, and I thought, well, maybe I should be a church planter. That sounds good. And I was excited about that. And one day in my quiet time, talking to the Lord and praying and reading the scriptures, I just heard the Lord speak to me or say to me that he wanted me to be a transitioner. And so the word transitioner, I immediately understood that to be what we now call revitalization. But rather than plant churches, go into existing churches to help them become missional and to fulfill the Great Commission. So I said, well, that sounds a little harder, Lord, but okay, we'll do that. And so from then on, that's what I've been determined to spend my life doing. And in the Anglican tradition is helping existing churches revitalize and become missional and fulfill the Great Commission better. And so for the last 2 decades, that's what I've been doing, both in local churches where I serve, and as you heard Bishop Sutton say, now with the AAC, helping other churches. So I'm just passionate about it. And most of what I'm going to share with you over the next rest of today and tomorrow afternoon is practical strategies and biblical principles and practical strategies that I learned on the ground. I learned in practice. So this stuff that I'm going to share with you is largely not stuff that I've read in academic books and want to pass on to you. It's practice, tried and true principles that I've got the scars to prove it. And so I just want to encourage you just to share that with you, that where I'm coming from. So with that out of the way, again, I'm real excited to talk to you. I love your REC 100 vision. I love the vision of planting. I love the vision of revitalizing existing congregation, because it revitalized congregations can plant churches. And so I'm happy to speak into that today. The plan for today and tomorrow is for me to kind of give these ideas about how to help traditional Anglican churches create a missional culture, and where it needs to turn around and to start growing again. So to do that, and I also want to say one more thing, and then we'll jump in. But oftentimes, if I go around the province and speak on revitalization, how to grow and things like that, people are concerned that I'm going to come into their church and tell them that they need to change their liturgy and change, bring in smoke machines and drums or whatever. And I just want you to know that's not what I'm going to be saying over the next 2 days. I value being Anglican and being traditional Anglicans, but there are things we need to do to adapt to be missional that are key and necessary if we want our churches to survive. Traditional Anglican churches that don't adapt to a missional culture in our current times will decline, and if they don't make the changes necessary to be missional, they'll eventually close. They'll eventually die, and it's a sad statement, but we're seeing it happen where churches don't adapt. But I like the language of adapt, but not abandon. We adapt to missional strategies and culture without abandoning our traditional Anglicanism. So we're going to talk about these different ways to revitalize our churches. But before we do that, I want to start today with the problem. Before you can really jump into solutions to churches that are in decline or not growing, we need to understand why that's happening. So let me talk a little bit about the problem the rest of this session, kind of how we got into this situation, and then we'll talk about solutions most of the time today and tomorrow. As I pull up my screen, I'm going to share screen, and as I do that, I want to let you know that on your schedules, it doesn't include a break for my teaching time today, but I want you to know that there'll be a break halfway between the sessions. I've got a first session, a break, second session today, and then the same tomorrow. So just know that I'm aware of your comfort levels listening to somebody on Zoom. All right, so what's the problem? I want to talk about two major challenges or problems that churches, our traditional churches, are facing in our current culture that we need to know about and be able to address. The first problem is unique to all churches, and really at any time in history. It's not unique to our current culture, and it's something called the church life cycle. So let me just kind of talk about this, and as I talk about this, see if you can relate to this in your congregation at all. So a church life cycle goes like this. There's the overview. Let me click it here. Sorry. There's the overview. there's always a birth, a church that's birthed, usually inclines. If it's not careful, sometime it'll get into recline, often called maintenance or plateau. And if things aren't addressed there, they'll go into decline. And then eventually, if things aren't addressed, churches will close. And churches have been birthed, and local churches have been birthed and closed over the last 2,000 years regularly. Now, the church doesn't close, the kingdom of God continues, but local churches that don't can fall into this cycle. So let's look at each stage. So at some point, there's a birth. And a church, every church that you're in was a church plant at some time, right? Someone at some point said, hey, we need to have a church here. And it was planted, it was birthed. Might have been a long time ago, but it was originally a plant. So it birthed. And then because there was an emerging incline, so growth started to happen. And look at these, as I go through these, just sort of look at some of the characteristics of I'm going to minimize my screen, of an inclining church. They're future oriented, and they're future oriented because there's no past. You don't really have anything to look back to. So it's like, hey, we're doing this for a reason, and we're going forward. We want to grow this church, hopefully reach people for Jesus. Then they're vision driven. They're driven by, there's some vision that compelled this church to get started, and they're driven by that vision. We got to do this, and we're moving forward. And it's community focused. By community focus here, I'm talking about outside community, like in the REC 100, and Bishop Sutton talked about earlier, the need to focus on those outside the church and the community. That's the mission. So an inclining church is focused on those outside to try to bring them in to the church and make disciples. And then because of that, because it's driven by, focused on community and the vision, there's conversion growth. People are coming in to know Christ, to be baptized and made disciples. But then there's a church, the church gets into incline. Then in the incline, that's going good. You want to be in incline. That's where we want our churches to be. Developed incline is kind of, as we talk about this is where you want a thriving church would look like. You want our churches to thrive. These are the kind of things that would be in present. You have a future and present oriented. In other words, you're still primarily oriented on where we're going in the future. We're trying to fulfill some mission for God moving forward and growing. But now, because you've had enough growth and you're established a little bit, there's present things you need to focus on, and keeping care of the flock and worship services and programs starting and things like that. So you're focused on the present. Also, and that's a good thing. That's a church is going to always have the present to orient, but also primarily driven by oriented on where are we going next. That's healthy. They're also a developed inclined church or a thriving church. They're still vision driven and driven by where are we going? Why does God have us doing this? What's our specific vision? But you're also now driven by programs. We've got these programs that are going, and they're working, and we need to keep them going and keep working on them. So you're split a little bit from not just vision, but your vision and program. And that's, again, normal and okay. Then but you also see a community focused. You're still focused on the community, those outside, trying to reach the lost, and those front porch ministries and all those things, and bringing them in. But because you have a congregation existing, you have to focus on the congregation as well. And then finally, you're still seeing conversion growth because you're still primarily driven and focused on reaching those outside. But because there's enough going on, it's sort of like, oh, this is, people hear about the church, or people move into town, and where should I go? And oh, that church is doing stuff, and you'll see some transfer growth. And again, that's all good. Problem is when and how churches get into decline eventually is right here, which we call emerging recline. And it's really subtle, but notice the subtle shifts in those different areas. All of a sudden, instead of being primarily future oriented, the present takes the priority. So you're present oriented and still thinking about the future some. And again, I'm sure you can relate to that, but it's also like, oh, the tyranny of the urgent starts setting in, like, oh, I've got to make sure those hospital visits get done, and I got to make sure the bulletins get done, and I got to make sure that the sermon gets written, or, on and on and all those stuff, that there's just always more things that need to get done. And then you go, oh, by the way, yeah, we should be thinking about what are we doing in the future? What's our plan for Lent this year? And before you'd plan out Lent 6 months ahead of time, now you're like, oh, I guess we're 3 weeks ahead of time. What are we going to do this year? So it's just, you're so busy, you forget to think about the future as much. Same thing with program and vision. The programs that are going, they're going well, and they're running, but they become so, it takes so much effort to be keeping them going. The vision takes a little bit of the backseat, and you say, well, we still have our vision, but you don't talk about it as much. It's just sort of finds its way to that place that most churches, where the vision is on the bulletin somewhere on the website, but no one really knows what it is. It just starts taking a little bit of a backseat. And then you've got, you see the same, but again, at this point, things are still good. Things are still fine. You've got people coming, and it's seemingly fine. So you don't know that there's a potential problem coming. But you see another shift here with congregation/community focus. The existing congregation becomes more and more the focus of our energies and time, and less thought and energy gets put into going out into the community. That missional part takes a little bit of backseat to maintaining what we have and keeping it going. And then you still see some transfer growth and maybe still some conversion growth, because you're not completely ignoring the outside community. So again, at that point of emerging recline, everything seems fine. And that's where it's important for leaders to be like always watching for this and not letting that settle in. So then, because then recline can set in, and then let's talk about that. And this is sort of developed recline or maintenance or plateau. And look, again, subtle shifts that you see here. Now the present is really where you're oriented and keeping going what we have. And you start talking a little bit more about, well, remember back when we used to do that, and remember when this used to happen. And so you start thinking more about how the good old days were, because it seems like something's changed. Keep going here. Program becomes the primary you're driven by. Again, we got to keep these. We've been doing these programs, and we can't let them. And sometimes at this point, you start seeing programs may not be working as well as they used to work. Maybe they're not being as effective as they used to, but we got to keep them going because we've always done this program, that kind of language. And so we're just doing, and we can't stop this program because Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so or whomever might be upset if we stop it. So we keep the program going. We're driven by that. And then vision's kind of way in the back seat. We're not even thinking about vision. And we're really focused more on like, we got to put better structures in place to keep this thing going, because we're a little worried that the wheels are getting a little loose on this thing. So let's tighten things up with some structures, and that structures aren't bad, but that's not going to solve the recline or potential decline problem. Okay, so then keeping going, congregation becomes the focus. You're really focused on keeping the folks we have happy and there, and we don't want to lose anybody. And you start putting more emphasis on the core, which is, you've got that 20% of folks that's doing all the work kind of thing, and we got to keep them engaged. I see the chat. I just want to make sure if any of that's for me. Okay, so congregation core focus. So again, you're really focused on it, but notice the main idea here is community is out of the picture. No one's even thinking about who are the unchurched we're trying to reach, who is our mission field in our community. That's really taken a back seat. And then at this point, you might get some transfer growth still. Then you see, get into emerging decline. I'm going to speed up a little bit here because I'm sure you can kind of see the point. But emerging decline is now structure. You're really structure driven, and even your programs are becoming, maybe you can't even keep the programs going like you used to. So programs drop off because we don't have enough people to even do them anymore. And so, well, we can't keep that going. And again, we really are worried about things. So you start trying to put more controls on it to solve the problem of less attendance and less money. So we got to put more control, which again doesn't, in fact, it feeds the decline rather than leads back to incline, with being vision driven, future oriented, and community focused, et cetera. So again, I think you're seeing a pattern here. Your past oriented and a little bit of present, because you still have people coming and things going on. So you've got to be focused on the present some, but you're really thinking about, man, remember when, back in the good old days, the golden years. And then you have, you maybe have some transfer growth, but I don't even think that's likely at this point for the most part, unless you have an Anglican move into town and they might come. And then core congregation focus. Again, really, we got to keep the core, because we can't lose any of our core, because then we'll be in real financial trouble and those kind of things. And we can't make decisions that we're worried about making decisions that will lead to growth, because, well, what if we, some of our core families that are our biggest givers leave, then we're going to be in real trouble. So it just kind of feeds the decline. And again, full-fledged decline. I'll go fast here. Past-oriented, structure-driven, core focused, no growth. And if that's not at that point, if things aren't addressed, it can lead to death. So that's sort of the overview of the life cycle. I want to take a minute I want to ask you to take a minute. It'll be maybe a little awkward in terms of being here on Zoom, to have some silence for a few seconds. But I just want to give you an opportunity to just reflect and just sort of do a gut level assessment of your own congregation. If I was to be there in person with you right now and we were just looking at each other, when I asked what is your gut level assessment of your church, would you say you're an incline, recline, or decline? Just again, it's not a scientific, but just what do you think based on your experience in your church? So go ahead and think about that for a second, and then I'll bring you back. All right, so again, I've done this enough where generally you have a pretty good idea of where your church is in this process. And what, I'm getting ahead a little bit, but what church revitalization is all about is about helping churches, especially in the even emerging recline, developed recline, or even in deep decline, to turn around and become missional, to get back to a place of incline. And it's totally possible because I've seen it. It's not like I believe it by faith. I believe it because I've seen it, and I've seen churches do it. So what the things we're going to talk about later today and tomorrow are the kind of things that'll help a church get back to the place of incline. So let me keep going, and just hold that thought on where you see your church is, and hold out. Because wherever you are, it's possible to turn things around. All right, so let me keep going. That was the first problem, is the church life cycle. And that's unique. That's not unique to our culture, our times. That's just true for local churches. The other problem that we have to pay attention to and watch out for, or really that's facing our churches in our day, is the cultural changes that have gone on all around us. Bishop Sutton's report this morning, or presentation, was amazing, and is addressing some of we all know, we can feel that the culture has just changed radically away from Christianity kind of before our eyes and in our lifetimes. And so our churches are feeling the effect of that, and we need to understand and address it, and that's where we need to adapt largely. So let's get into some of the issues in our culture. So there's been over the last 50 plus years, there's been different church growth models, for lack of a better term. And so, first talk about 50 years or so ago, or maybe not even that long ago, for an Anglican church, Episcopal church, I'm sure an REC church, to grow, or to plant, to grow, and to survive and even thrive in a time that historians are now calling Christendom in America. It was a time when primarily people were if they weren't Christian, again, I I was in that. I was very churched. I just didn't necessarily know Jesus, but I would have thought I was a Christian. And I was in essence wanting to live a life of a biblical moral Judeo-Christian life, and my unsaved mom and dad, who are now saved. But at the time raising me, they were in church every Sunday. My dad was the senior warden, and all these kind of things. So Don Vester, but they didn't know Jesus. But they were raising me in a biblical Judeo-Christian moral view, etc. So Christendom. Point is, in that time, we all know it. We've experienced it. But for a church to grow, it basically needed to be in the right place and have a plant, have a building, have a location, and all the folks in that neighborhood who were Anglican-like and liturgical, they'd come to one of our churches. If they were Methodist, they'd go to the Methodist church. If they were Presbyterian, to Presbyterian, to Baptist to Baptist. And so you didn't really have to be missional. You didn't have to really think about who are the unchurched out there we need to reach and connect with relationally and bring in. As long as you had decent preaching and programs, and you had good children's ministry, choir or whatever, people would of your brand, of our brand preference would show up. And again, it was fine. So we didn't have to work too hard. Well, that Christendom time is long gone. We all know it. That's what I was referring to earlier. We're way past that. And so hoping that our churches will grow based on that Christendom model is just not a non-starter in 2021. But some of our churches, frankly, across the province are still hoping that a Christendom church growth model will work. If we just have better music, if we just have better, we got to get a different priest in here who's a better preacher or something. If we just have a youth minister who's going to provide a good youth ministry, well, nothing wrong with that. Or if we just have a better sign out front, and spend 20 grand on a sign that has scrolling words on it. I'm not opposed to a 20 grand sign with scrolling words on it, but if that's all you're going to do to grow and hope that people see your sign and show up, not going to happen. Not going to happen. Maybe an REC person or an Anglican who moves to town may show up, but you get the point. So those days are gone. Okay, we can't do that. Somewhere along the lines, people started thinking about that or figuring that out. And so somewhere in the late 80s, 90s, early 2000s, there was a model that was what's being called the attractional model that became real popular and fairly effective in terms of seeing churches grow. This is when I was going through seminary in the late 90s and my first, probably 6 or 7 years of ordained ministry, I was schooled in and practiced the attractional model, which was basically, okay, we just need to be more attractive. And if we have better greeter systems and, welcome tables and have the right coffee mugs and, little gift bags that we can hand out to visitors. And if we're more attractive than the other church, then we can get some of those people to come to our church instead of somewhere else. But again, it was still kind of thinking through the model was still like, there's sort of church people out there. They're going to go to church somewhere. We just want to attract them to our church. But it wasn't necessarily missional. It wasn't like we've got to go out there and get them. We're just trying to attract them with better programming or better stuff to get them to show up. Again, some people, that's where the whole, the seeker sensitive and the seeker kind of churches, that was a real part of that. I was never into, being a seeker sensitive church, but still kind of bought into that. In other words, like we're going to keep being Anglican and not abandon that to try to bring people in. But still, we want to just try to get them to come in. And that worked. When I was in Midland, Texas, for example, between 2003 and 2006, the church there grew from 180 to 330 on a Sunday. Basically doing this. So we just anyway, I won't go through the whole story, but it worked back in those days. But it may still work a little here and there, but in somewhere in the South, in more Christian areas, like some of you are in Texas and it may still work a little bit, but by and large, that's not even working anymore. So all that to say is that now, today, 2021 and moving forward, we have to adapt to and embrace a missional model. I'm not saying anything you haven't already heard from your leaders in the REC 100 and Bishop Sutton. We've got to adapt this missional model where we're thinking not how do we get people to show up, but how do we identify Who are the unchurched people in our community outside of us that we can go to, build relationship with, and then bring in to make disciples? Again, the front porch ministries and the belonging before believing and all the things that you talk about. That's got to happen. And where churches aren't adapting to that missional mindset, that missional culture, they're going to stay in the decline or recline mode. So it just happened. Another thing I think that's just interesting, I think it's helpful just for helping you to see kind of how we got to where we are and why we need to embrace this missional culture, is these three key dates. I mean, and these are kind of loose. This isn't like, this isn't a history lesson that I would, but just sort of around these times, some shifts happen in our culture that impacted our church's lack of mission, that kind of led to this kind of an idea that many of our churches have, is like, well, that's not our problem. We don't need to worry about that. We'll just do our thing. And so in 1939, and right around there was a big movement towards the parachurch movement, which, again, praise God for parachurch movements, and things like InterVarsity came along. And so they become the experts at reaching college students, and then Young Life and things like that, which, again, love Young Life, but they became the experts at reaching teenagers. And then, so other parachurch ministries became focused and specialized in these missional outreaches to different groups, right? And so for the local church, it was like, well, hey, now that's great. We'll just support them. We don't have to be the experts on evangelism and mission. We'll just support, we'll give money to them, and they can be the experts and do it. And they were very successful at it. But for the local church, it kind of left this mindset of, well, that's great. We're supporting mission, but we don't have to do it. And we don't have to be trained in it. We don't have to know how to do it ourselves. So it's someone else's problem. We'll just support it. And then in 1948, kind of post-World War II era, there was the whole emergence of suburban life, right? And so this suburbs popped up all over the place. And so as these neighborhoods popped up and continue to do so, the message of the suburbs was, hey, leave downtown, leave those problems, leave the mess of that, and come out here where it's clean and safe and fun, and there's pools and there's all this stuff, and you don't have to look at whatever, homeless people and other problems and drugs and whatever. You just come out here, and it's going to be this nice, clean, safe, fun. And so churches popped up in those suburbs with the message of, hey, we're a clean, safe, fun church. That's what we're all about. Come here, because and we're here. It'll be clean bathrooms, clean children's ministries, and it'll be safe and it'll be fun. And so kind of let that, so it's not our problem. We're not worried. We can't worry about all that missional messiness out there, that engaging with the real broken, messed up sinners. We just want to create these little nice places of clean, safe, fun Christian community. Again, I'm not saying it's all bad, but it kind of left a little bit in the local church, in the suburban especially, like, that's not our problem. We'll let someone else deal with that. And then finally, in 1964, in around there, and really ever since then, when LBJ did the war on poverty, it kind of sent this message to the churches, like, look, the government's going to take care of poverty. The government's going to take care of this. And so more and more, and again, I'll avoid getting into politics, but as more and more the government has set itself up as to be the one who's going to take care of these problems, it's left the message for the local church of, well, not our problem. They'll take care of that. So all of that happens. If all those other things are being taken care of by others, what's that left for a typical local traditional church? Well, if I was there, I'd ask for a question, but I'll just answer it. By and large, it's left us with worship and discipleship. Where we focus on our worship and our liturgy and all the things that go into worship, which is fantastic, and discipleship. But even our discipleship is largely a discipleship around head knowledge and Bible knowledge. But I agree with Bishop Sutton. We largely, even that kind of discipleship that we've had has left a pretty biblically illiterate group of disciples as far as the worldview. But we know we have Bible studies on this or that, but by and large, we haven't had churches full of disciples who understand what it is to be a missional follower of Jesus, who's trying to impact the world around us with the gospel and all the things that we talked about, you talked about this morning. So it's just left our churches. Well, what we do is we show up on Sundays and we worship. We have some Bible studies here and there, and maybe occasionally we have some service projects. But our service projects tended to be and have tended to be more what I would classify as sort of like Rotary projects. They're, hey, we do some good service project here and there to help people, but they're not necessarily evangelistic in nature or service out in the community in order to actually lead people to Jesus and make them his disciples. All right, so that's a lot of information, and then we're about at a stopping point for a comfort break. So with those problems between the life cycle, which is true for any church, even church plants, by the way, if they're not careful, 6-7 years in, can start getting into needing revitalization. And also this cultural shift that's happened. We have a lot of churches in our province that are in recline and decline. So that's what church revitalization is all about. And here's what we believe. And again, we're going to spend most of our time, the rest of the time, on solutions. But here's what we believe. We believe that the local church is the hope of the world. God's plan to bring his kingdom on earth and establish it is through the local church. Again, parachurch ministry is fine, but it's not someone else's problem, it's our problem. And if every local church would figure out and do its part, what God's mission for that local church for the world, then the world will be transformed. Okay, so we've got to recapture our local churches being these missional, as in your own language, these mission stations for the kingdom of God in our communities. And that's what revitalization is all about, is how to do that. We've kind of boiled down what it takes to revive a church into an acrostic called Revive. And what you see here on the screen, which in our seminars we teach, we do that. And so in the sessions today and tomorrow, what we're going to talk about is I can't do everything that we teach, but in the time we have, but I'm going to get different key parts of these, what we found to work to revitalize churches in our day, that we've gotten this acrostic called Revive. So with that, we'll stop for a comfort break.